It began, as most strange things do, in a moment so quiet you could almost mistake it for nothing at all. A faint hum in the air, the smell of dust warmed by an old lamp, and a boy standing by a window, watching a city that wasn't his own flicker against the dark. You may not know this yet, but we truly love and care for you. Not in the loud, demanding way of the world, but in the way that lets you rest without proving anything first. We're glad you're here, safe in this little corner of the night with us. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. Morty had always been a watcher, not the kind who stares because he's curious about people, though he was sometimes, but the kind who notices the way light pools in certain corners of a room, or how voices soften when people think no one's listening. Even as a child, he moved slower than the others. His classmates would rush down corridors, shouting and laughing, but Morty would linger by the glass, tracing condensation with his fingertip, following the curve of a droplet until it vanished. His grandfather Rick was a different kind of slow. A mind always quick, but a body sometimes tired. He would spend long hours bent over some device that hummed and glowed in ways Morty could never quite understand. They didn't speak much on those nights. Rick didn't ask Morty to fetch tools, and Morty didn't ask what he was making. It was enough just to be there, in the smell of warm metal, in the soft click of a spanner turning. One evening, long before he understood what the Citadel was, Morty saw it for the first time. Not up close, not in the way the adventuring Mortys would brag about, but from a faraway outpost where Rick had set up a temporary lab. Through the smudged glass of the apartment window, Morty could see it. A cluster of shining towers lit like 100 tiny suns, hovering in the black between worlds. It didn't look like danger. It didn't look like history. It looked alive. He didn't tell Rick he'd been watching it. Not then. Some things were better kept close, as if saying them out loud would make them smaller. Instead, he memorized the way it glowed, and how the stars around it seemed dimmer by comparison. Years later, he would think back to that first sight, and realize the strange truth. The Citadel he saw that night was already burning in a way, not with fire, but with the quiet inevitability of things too large to last. And maybe that's why he watched so intently, even as a boy. Somewhere inside him he knew that one day it wouldn't be there anymore, but for now it was simply part of the night. And Morty, still small, still quiet, stood by the window and let the sight sink deep into him, a light he would carry long after the towers were gone. If Morty's memories of the Citadel were made of stillness, his memories of Rick were made of flicker, shadows and light, anger and affection, silence and sudden laughter that startled the dust in the air. Rick was not like the other Ricks Morty had glimpsed in crowded streets or half-heard in passing conversations. His eyes still burned with calculation, yes, but they also softened sometimes, as if something fragile had been left inside and survived. He didn't explain much. He didn't need to. Morty learned that sometimes understanding wasn't about having the answers. It was about standing beside someone long enough to see the patterns in their silences. At night, their small home hummed. In the corner, machines Rick had half finished would emit tiny beeps like a heart monitor. Other devices simply glowed, bathing the room in a pale green or amber light that seemed to move when Morty's eyes grew tired. Rick never turned them off. He said they were important to keep running, though Morty always suspected it was the comfort of their sound he really meant. There were days when Rick would disappear for hours, stepping through a portal with a wave that wasn't quite a goodbye, and Morty would stay behind. He'd sit at the workbench, looking at the scatter of tools, trying to guess what each one was for. He'd pick up a small spanner, feel its weight in his hand, and then put it back exactly where it had been. Rick always noticed when things were moved, though he never complained when it was Morty. Some evenings they would sit on the balcony together, Rick with a mug of something strong, Morty with a cup of cocoa that steamed in the cold air. They wouldn't talk about anything important, maybe about the way the stars seemed brighter that night, or the sound of a distant engine somewhere in the Citadel's direction. Morty liked those talks because they didn't feel like lessons. They felt like two people leaning into the same quiet. Rick's presence was a strange kind of shelter. He could be sharp sharp with words, sharp with impatience. But there was a gravity to him that kept Morty anchored, even when the rest of the world seemed too big, too fast. Morty never said it, but he trusted Rick, even in the moments he didn't understand him. It would be a long time before Morty realized that trust is built not in grand gestures, but in the way someone keeps showing up, even in fragments, even in half-light. And Rick, in his own fractured way, always did. The first time Morty set foot in the Citadel, it wasn't because of an adventure. It wasn't even supposed to be memorable. Rick had to meet someone, an old contact maybe, or a version of himself who owed him a favour, and Morty was brought along, not as a sidekick, but simply because there was nowhere else for him to be. They arrived in one of the less busy sectors, where the towers were shorter and the air was warmer. The streets curved instead of running straight, as if they'd been built for wandering rather than rushing. And wandering was exactly what Morty did. The market was small by Citadel standards, but to Morty it felt endless. Stalls draped in soft fabrics swayed in a gentle artificial breeze. Lanterns hung at different heights, some glowing white, others pulsing in slow, ocean-like rhythms. The air smelled faintly of spice and metal, a combination that was strange at first, but oddly comforting after a few breaths. Vendors called out, not in the sharp, loud way of competing merchants, but in voices that seemed to float. One sold fruit that shifted colours depending on who was holding it. Another sold bottled lights, not flames, but tiny captured glows that swirled when you tilted the jar. Morty stopped to watch one swirl for a long time, wondering where the light inside had come from and whether it remembered. He noticed something else too. Not every Rick and Morty here looked busy. Some were simply being. Sitting on low stools, sharing drinks, talking quietly, or just watching the slow drift of the market crowd. In a place built on constant invention and negotiation, there was a rare stillness here. Rick eventually found him near a stall selling paper maps of worlds that didn't exist anymore. The old man barely glanced at the merchandise before ushering Morty along, but Morty kept one of the maps in his mind. It had been drawn in ink that shimmered when the light hit it, and though he'd never been to the places marked, he felt a strange nostalgia, as if he'd once lived there in a dream. Later that night, back in their room, Morty thought about the market. He didn't think about the prices or even the things for sale. What stayed with him was the way the lanterns swayed, the way voices softened in that place, and the way it felt to walk among so many without feeling rushed. It would be one of the first memories he returned to in the years ahead, a reminder that even in the heart of something as vast and fractured as the Citadel, there were pockets of gentleness. Places you could breathe without feeling like you had to keep up. It happened in the most ordinary way, the kind of meeting you don't notice until later, when you realize it stayed with you. Morty had wandered back to the market district one afternoon, while Rick was buried in some kind of negotiation. He followed the scent of warm bread and something sweeter, almost like honey, almost like smoke, until he found himself at the edge of the stalls, where the light from the Citadel towers was softer and the air felt cooler. That's where he saw him, another Morty, sitting cross-legged on the ground, portal gun in his lap. It was an older model, scuffed and dented, the metal worn pale where hands had held it too often. The boy's expression wasn't frustrated, the way someone fixing something usually looks. It was patient, almost fond, like a person tending to an old pet. "You know, it's never going to work right again," Morty said, before he could stop himself. His voice wasn't mocking, just curious. The other Morty looked up, smiling in a way that wasn't defensive at all. "Yeah, that's kind of the point." They talked. Slowly at first, as if testing the space between their words. This Morty explained that his portal gun could still open doors, but only to places it considered safe. That was the word he used, safe. Not coordinates, not dimensions, not destinations of value. Safe. And sometimes it didn't work at all. "I don't fix it because I like where it takes me," he said, eyes drifting toward the sky between the towers. "I don't need to go everywhere anymore, just somewhere that feels okay." They spent the afternoon walking together through the quieter lanes, finding a tiny cafe tucked between two leaning walls. The owner served drinks in chipped cups, and steam curled in the cool air like slow-moving clouds. Morty couldn't remember the taste of what he drank, but he remembered the sound of the spoon clinking against the cup, the way the other Morty leaned back in his chair like he'd been there 100 times before. When the time came to leave, the other Morty took out the portal gun, pressed the button, and a doorway bloomed, soft-edged, glowing, humming like a lullaby. Through it, Morty could see a stretch of green grass under a pink-tinged sky. No buildings, no noise, just open space and the suggestion of a warm breeze. "Where's that?" Morty asked. "Don't know," the boy said, "but it's always there when I need it." They didn't exchange names, which seemed fitting somehow. As Morty walked back to Rick, he thought about the broken portal gun, how sometimes broken things still worked, just differently. And in the quiet of that evening, he felt the soft truth settle inside him. Not every doorway has to lead somewhere new. Sometimes it's enough that it leads somewhere gentle. Some places stay with you, not because of what happened there, but because of how they felt. Dimension C-37 was like that for Morty. Rick hadn't meant for them to stop there. It was a pause, a quick refuel, a small repair, a nothing visit on the way to somewhere else. But they arrived in the middle of a soft rain, and the air held a scent Morty had never smelled before. Not sharp like storms back home, not earthy like wet soil. This was warmer. Cinnamon, maybe. Or the memory of cinnamon. Sweet in a way that made you close your eyes when you breathed it in. They took shelter under the awning of a small building, while Rick fiddled with some component in his coat pocket. Morty stood at the edge, watching the rain hit the cobblestones in ripples that overlapped and broke apart. The street was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. The rain seemed to hum, not a song exactly, but something rhythmic, like the gentle tick of an old clock. A woman came out of the shop beside them and set a small jar on the windowsill. It filled slowly with rainwater, the drops making a soft plinking sound as they hit. She noticed Morty watching and smiled, though she didn't speak. Her smile was the kind that didn't need anything added to it. Rick muttered something about this place having better climate control than most, and told Morty to stay put. He disappeared into the next street, and Morty just stayed. The rain carried its scent into his clothes, his hair, his thoughts. He tried to guess if it came from the trees, the air, the stone. He decided it didn't matter. Some things didn't need to be solved. By the time Rick returned, the rain was slowing. The woman took the jar from the windowsill and without a word handed it to Morty. The glass was cool, the water inside faintly golden in the fading light. He didn't drink it. He knew somehow that it wasn't for that. When they left, Morty held the jar in his lap. Rick didn't ask about it, and Morty didn't explain. He kept it for years after, never opening it, never pouring it out, until the scent faded completely. Even then, he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Long after the Citadel burned, long after other worlds blurred together in his memory, Morty would still think about that rain, the way it made the whole world smell like something worth keeping. Morty first saw her in one of the Citadel's narrow glass corridors, the kind that felt like walking through the inside of a crystal. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and in her hands she carried something that caught the light, not bright, but soft, like moonlight seen through water. She was about his age, though she moved like someone older. Her hair was tied back loosely, strands falling over her face as she held a small device close to her lips. When she spoke, the device glowed faintly, and a faint vibration seemed to hum through the glass walls. Morty thought she was talking to someone far away, but when he got closer, he realized she was recording herself. Or rather, she wasn't recording words. She was recording sounds. Later, when they finally spoke, she explained. "I collect echoes," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Voices, footsteps, bits of music, anything that might not happen again. The device was old and worn. She said it could hold thousands of sounds, but only if she kept them short. Most were just a few seconds long. The clink of two glasses touching, the sigh of an elevator door closing, the chirp of an alien bird in some forgotten plaza. Morty asked her why. "Because people forget what the world sounds like," she said simply. "When you remember a place, you remember what it looked like. But sound sounds like the part of a dream you can't tell anyone about." They spent an afternoon together wandering the quieter levels of the Citadel. She showed him how to hold the device just so, to catch the way certain corners gathered whispers, or how to record the faint hiss of the air vents that never seemed to stop. She gave him one of her oldest recordings, the sound of rain on metal, recorded years ago in some dimension she couldn't even name now. Morty kept that recording in his pocket for a long time. Sometimes he played it when he couldn't sleep, letting the soft patter pull him into dreams. Before they parted, she told him that echoes were tricky. You can't keep them forever, she said, because even if you have the sound, you'll never have the exact air it was breathed into, or the way your heart felt when you heard it the first time. Morty didn't understand that fully then, but he would. And years later, when so much else had been lost, he would still remember her voice, saying those words, not as a memory of her face, but as an echo, playing softly in the dark. The corridor wasn't marked on any of the Citadel's maps. Morty found it by accident, drifting away from the familiar levels into a place where the air felt faintly warm, as if the walls themselves were breathing. It was long, much longer than it seemed it should be, and its walls were made of a material he couldn't name. They weren't quite glass, but light moved through them in slow, rippling patterns, like water being stirred. Standing there felt like standing inside the reflection of a dream. The first time, he didn't walk the whole way. He just stood at the entrance, watching the colours shift, pale gold into soft violet, fading into a blue so deep it seemed to hum. His eyes grew heavy. He blinked once, twice, and when they opened, he wasn't entirely sure if he'd been awake the whole time. The second time, he stepped inside. His footsteps didn't echo the way they should have. Instead, they were absorbed, as if the corridor was listening. Halfway down, he began to feel it. That drifting sensation, like the moment before sleep when thoughts stop making sense but still feel important. He saw things he didn't remember seeing before. Rick's hands setting a mug down, the girl who collected echoes leaning over her device, the smell of cinnamon rain from Dimension C-37 curling in the air like mist. He wasn't sure if they were memories or dreams. It didn't seem to matter. When he reached the end, there was only a wall, plain, smooth, no doors. He touched it, expecting it to feel warm, but it was cool, almost damp, like stone just after rain. And then, without meaning to, he closed his eyes. In that blink of darkness, he heard voices, not speaking to him, not even speaking words he could follow, just the comfort of people existing near each other. It was the sound of life in its smallest form. When he opened his eyes again, he was back at the entrance. He hadn't turned around. The corridor had simply let him go. He returned often after that, not to look for answers, and the corridor didn't seem to have any, but to rest. Some nights he would walk halfway and sit on the smooth floor, letting the shifting light wash over him until his thoughts were softer, smaller, easier to hold. In time, he began to think of it not as a place to pass through, but as a place that held pieces of him, little fragments he could leave behind, safe in the ripple of colours. Pieces he might one day need again. Some nights carry a weight you can feel without knowing why. The Citadel had always been restless, but that evening it felt unsettled. Like a song just a little out of tune. Morty was in the market district again, though the crowds were smaller now. Stalls closed earlier than usual, lanterns swayed with no wind. Conversations seemed shorter. People looked over their shoulders without meaning to. Even the air felt strange, heavier, as if it had been holding its breath for too long. Rick had been gone most of the day, wrapped up in one of those tasks Morty knew better than to ask about. That left Morty to wander. He found himself walking without aim, past familiar corners and into quieter streets. The hum of the Citadel's great engines, normally steady and constant, seemed to pulse in uneven waves. When he passed the girl who collected echoes, she didn't stop to talk. She just lifted her device, pressed a button, and recorded the silence between them. That silence felt like it had shape, like it was made of something heavy enough to hold. Later, as the artificial night deepened, the glow of the towers seemed brighter than usual, not in a way that comforted, but in a way that warned. Morty sat on a low wall outside a cafe and watched the lights. People moved around him, some hurrying, some pretending not to. A group of Ricks stood together in the distance, speaking in clipped sentences. Their laughter, when it came, sounded like the clink of glass about to break. By the time Rick returned, his coat smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no fire. He didn't explain it, and Morty didn't ask. They walked back together through streets that were too quiet for their size, the sound of their footsteps the only steady rhythm. That night, Morty couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, the same way he had years before when he first saw the Citadel, and watched the city's lights shift against the dark. Something was moving in the distance. Not a crowd, not a storm, but something slower, stranger. He didn't know it then, but this was the last time he would see the Citadel whole, the last night before the fire. And though nothing had yet begun, Morty felt the truth deep in his chest. Some endings don't arrive all at once. They begin quietly, in the way a place feels just before it changes forever. It began without sound. At least, from where Morty stood, it was silent, as if the air itself refused to carry the noise across the distance. He had woken in the middle of the night, restless, pulled from sleep by nothing he could name. Rick wasn't in the room. The machines hummed faintly, but their rhythm no longer comforted him. He went to the window, drawn as though some part of him had always known this moment was coming. The Citadel was burning, not all at once, not a single eruption or blaze, but in fragments. Towers that had once gleamed like stars were fractured, glowing from within as if they had swallowed their own light and couldn't hold it anymore. The fire didn't flicker like ordinary fire. It moved strangely, bending and stretching against the black, painting the space around it in shifting colours that didn't belong to any natural flame. From his distance, Morty couldn't hear the panic, couldn't see the crowds. He only saw light folding in on itself, rising, collapsing, rising again. It was terrible and beautiful all at once, like watching a star collapse into something new. He pressed his forehead against the glass, the coolness grounding him. His chest felt heavy, though he couldn't have said why. The Citadel wasn't his home. He hadn't lived there, hadn't belonged to it the way others had. And yet, as he watched it unravel, he felt something inside him fray too. Behind him, the door opened. Rick stepped in quietly, his face unreadable. He didn't tell Morty to look away. He didn't explain what had happened or why. He just stood beside him, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the same distant fire. They stayed like that for a long time. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Morty noticed the reflection of the flames in Rick's eyes. Not fear, not pride, but something quieter. Resignation, maybe. Memory. A recognition that this was always going to happen. And Morty, standing next to him, realized he would remember this not as destruction, but as stillness. The stillness of watching something immense fade into the dark, carrying countless lives and voices with it. By morning, the fires would dim. By morning, the Citadel would be smoke and fragments. But in that moment, in the silence of the night, it was alive in its ending, and Morty carried the sight of it deeper than he carried any adventure. When Morty returned to the streets after the night of fire, the Citadel was quiet. Not silent, nothing alive could ever truly be silent, but quieter than it had ever been. Even the hum of engines seemed hesitant, as if they were listening to the spaces between sounds instead of making noise themselves. The survivors moved slowly. They didn't rush. There was no need. The city had been burned down, and in the absence of its old rhythm everything felt elongated, like time itself had been stretched. Morty saw them walking along fractured streets, carrying small bundles, sweeping dust off cracked cobblestones, tending to fragile lanterns that still glowed. Some stopped to speak with others, but only in soft tones, the kind that didn't startle the air. Their words were careful, measured, as though the world had become too fragile for shouting. He passed a small group of Ricks, their lab coats scorched, sleeves rolled up. They exchanged diagrams on scraps of paper, pointing and nodding, never raising their voices. Morty realized that the fire had not only taken towers and halls, it had taken urgency itself. People were left with only what mattered: connection, memory, and the faint, stubborn hope that life could go on. The girl who collected echoes appeared again. She moved between the survivors, device in hand, recording the small, quiet moments. Laughter, like a whisper, the creak of a door, the distant flapping of wings. Morty noticed her smile when someone brushed dust off a lamp, when a child handed water to a stranger. These tiny acts, almost invisible, were all she wanted to remember. Morty wandered with her for a while, carrying a small bundle of his own, a scrap of lighted glass he had picked up the night before. Together they left echoes of their presence in quiet corners, tiny reminders that someone had been here, and that this place, though broken, was not empty. By the time the sky began to pale, he found a rooftop and sat down, watching the survivors below. He didn't feel fear, not really. He felt part of something larger, a slow thread of life that stretched across the fragments of the city. Even in loss, there was tenderness. Even in ruin, there was care. And Morty, quiet as ever, understood that sometimes the greatest acts were not heroic, not loud, but simple. Sweeping dust, lighting a lantern, recording the faintest echoes. They were enough. Morty found it in a corner of the Citadel, wedged between the folds of a broken doorway. A small envelope, yellowed at the edges, with a simple inscription in handwriting that was almost lost to time. He picked it up and held it gently, as though it might crumble if he pressed too hard. Inside was a note, words written carefully, words never meant for him. He didn't read them aloud. He didn't even unfold the letter fully. There was something sacred in the idea of a message intended for someone else, something that existed only in hope and intention, and he didn't want to ruin it. Still, he carried it with him, slipping it into his coat pocket. It became a small weight against his chest, not heavy, but grounding. He would press his hand against it when the night felt too dark, when the ruins of the Citadel seemed too vast. He thought of the sender, whoever they were, and of the receiver, wherever they might have been. He imagined the letter travelling through time and space, lost in corridors like the ones he walked, waiting to arrive at a hand that might never open it. And he understood, in a quiet way, that some things mattered even if they were never received. That afternoon he sat on the edge of a broken balcony, watching the survivors move below. The city no longer burned, but the air carried a faint smoke, the scent lingering like memory. The girl who collected echoes passed by, device humming softly. She smiled at him. He nodded, feeling a connection in silence, a shared understanding that even in the aftermath small gestures could carry weight. He pressed the letter once more against his chest, not to send it, not to read it, but simply to acknowledge it. The world was vast and fragile and full of voices that might never reach their destination. And sometimes that was enough. That night, when he finally went to sleep, the letter remained tucked under his pillow. Its weight, gentle and steady, reminded him that some intentions, even when unseen, had their own quiet life. Morty wandered along the edge of the Citadel's ruins, where mist curled around broken towers like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. The air was cool and damp, but it carried a faint warmth, the warmth of light left behind. Scattered along the streets were lanterns. Some hung from posts, some rested on cracked stone, their flames small but steady. They swayed gently, unaffected by wind, as though their glow existed to soothe rather than illuminate. Morty paused at each one, noticing how the soft light pooled in puddles and cradled the edges of broken walls. The girl who collected echoes appeared beside him, device humming faintly. She didn't speak, but Morty could feel her presence. Together they moved slowly, carefully, as though the ruins themselves were listening. The mist clung to their clothes, their hair, and even the soles of their shoes, carrying the faint scent of rain from another world. He thought of the survivors, moving below in the pale dawn, tending to their small duties, dusting off fragments, mending lanterns, setting fires in hearths that no longer needed to cook. Each gesture was quiet, deliberate, a small act of insistence against loss. And Morty understood, more clearly than ever, that heroism was not always loud. Sometimes it was the soft light you nurtured in a misted ruin. He lingered at a lantern that had fallen from its post. Its flame flickered, delicate and bright, and he reached out, cupping it gently in his hands. For a moment he imagined the flame as a voice, small, persistent, carrying hope even when no one was listening. He let it go, after a heartbeat, watching it settle on a stone ledge and shine steadily. The Citadel, though fractured and still trembling from its own loss, felt less empty in that glow. The lanterns were not enough to light the whole city, but they were enough to remind Morty, and perhaps the world, that light persisted, even in fragments. He stood there for a long time, letting the mist wrap around him, letting the lanterns hum their quiet reassurance. And when he finally turned to leave, he carried a little of their light in his chest, a warmth he could take anywhere. Some nights, Morty could hear them. Not voices exactly, and not words, just the soft, lingering traces of existence, echoes of laughter, fragments of music, the faint hum of lives that had brushed against the Citadel's walls and moved on. He sat on a low rooftop, wrapped in a coat Rick had shrugged over, his shoulders earlier, watching the horizon between worlds. The Citadel lay in ruins below, quiet but not empty. From somewhere far beyond, he could feel whispers drifting, carrying stories that were never told, memories that were never shared. The girl who collected echoes was there again, kneeling on the same rooftop, device pressed to her lips. She recorded the subtle vibrations of the air, capturing the soft resonance of the universe folding in on itself. Morty didn't speak. He didn't need to. Listening was enough. He realized that the Citadel, though broken, was still alive in these small ways. In the way dust caught the light, in the way rainwater pooled in cracks, in the way survivors moved quietly, brushing fragments into shape. The world carried on between its spaces, between floors, corridors, dimensions, in whispers too soft to be noticed if you weren't paying attention. Morty closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He could feel the hum in his chest, a resonance of the quiet world around him. Each heartbeat echoed like a lantern's glow, small but steady. Somewhere below, a survivor hummed a song too low to be heard beyond their own ears, and Morty thought it was beautiful that even in ruin music could persist. He thought of the letter he had found, still tucked in his coat pocket, the portal gun that sometimes worked, and the echoes she recorded. Each was a small tether to something larger, something unbroken in a world that had seemed fractured. When he opened his eyes, the horizon was soft with dawn. The fires of the Citadel were nothing more than faint smoke now, curling into the sky, and Morty, quietly, understood that even when endings come, the world leaves traces, whispers between worlds, to remind us that life, in all its forms, continues. Morty walked through the empty halls of the Citadel, though empty felt like the wrong word. Shadows lingered here, moving along walls with a subtle life of their own. They didn't speak in words, but in murmurs, the soft, ungraspable communication of things that had witnessed too much yet refused to leave. He traced his fingers along the smooth surfaces of a corridor, feeling echoes of footsteps long gone. Every shadow seemed to have a rhythm, a pulse, and Morty realized he could follow it if he slowed enough. The Citadel had changed, yes, but it had not vanished. It breathed in fragments, in whispers, in the delicate interplay of light and dark. The girl who collected echoes followed him, device tucked under her arm. She paused frequently, capturing the way light bent along the corners, the faint sway of dangling wires, the small hums from machines still alive in the ruins. Morty didn't always understand why she did it, but he knew that preserving these shadows mattered, not as proof of survival, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the world had been, and still was, alive. He stopped at a doorway that had survived the fire. The edges were blackened, but the floor was untouched, dust gathering in perfect swirls. He leaned against the wall and listened. There was a softness there, like the Citadel itself was exhaling, and in that exhale he heard fragments, laughter of Ricks he would never meet, the soft sigh of Mortys who had known fear, the subtle vibrato of lives folding into memory. Morty closed his eyes. For a long while he did not move, did not speak. The shadows whispered, and he listened, allowing himself to be held by their quiet presence. There was sorrow, yes, but there was also gentleness. The Citadel, in its fragments and its silence, was teaching him something, that even endings have texture, even ruins carry a soft voice. When he finally stepped away, he did so with care, leaving space for the shadows to speak again. Somewhere between corridors, echoes, and fading light, Morty understood. These whispers were not just memories. They were guardians. They were proof that the small, tender details of a world are worth noticing, worth holding, worth remembering. Morty found himself on a ledge overlooking the remnants of the Citadel, the ruins below softened by mist and morning light. Above, stars lingered faintly, stubborn against the pale glow of the coming day. It felt like the world had paused, just for him, just long enough to breathe. He sat there quietly, legs dangling, hands resting lightly on the stone. The girl who collected echoes had gone ahead, leaving him alone with the gentle hum of the morning. He could hear the wind stirring through broken towers, carrying the faint scent of smoke and rain. It was calm, almost sacred, the way a world might feel when no one is rushing through it. Morty thought about everything he had seen: the markets, the broken portal guns, the fires, the survivors, the shadows, and the echoes. He realized that the Citadel story was not just one of destruction, it was also one of persistence. In small acts, in soft gestures, in the attention paid to tiny details, life continued. He leaned back and looked at the sky. The stars were slow, patient, stretching across the vastness, and he thought of all the worlds he had glimpsed, all the Mortys who had walked corridors like this, all the Ricks who had held pieces of brilliance and grief alike. And somewhere in that expanse he felt a thread connecting them all. Quiet, fragile, and strong. Morty closed his eyes for a long moment. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw lanterns, heard whispers, felt the soft rain of dimensions he had visited. The weight of memory and experience pressed gently against him, not heavy, but grounding. When he opened his eyes again, the Citadel glowed faintly in the morning haze, fragments of light stretching into mist. He smiled, a small, soft smile, knowing that endings were not just loss. They were also openings, a chance to hold on to the gentle truths that remain when everything else fades. And with that, he leaned back further, letting the vastness of space and memory cradle him. Somewhere, the girl collected echoes. Somewhere, survivors moved softly. Somewhere, life persisted in the quiet corners. Morty walked slowly across what remained of a long, fractured bridge. The rails were twisted, the planks uneven, but he didn't stumble. Each step was deliberate, careful, like tracing the memory of a place he had once known. The Citadel lay behind him in fragments, the morning mist softening the edges of what had been lost. The bridge stretched outward into the unknown. Beyond the gaps, beyond the broken spans, the world seemed to open into something wider. Soft hills, distant lights, and the faint hum of dimensions unseen. Morty felt a tug in his chest, a mixture of hesitation and longing. He had watched endings. He had felt the weight of fire and ruin. And now, here, there was the possibility of something new. He paused midway, leaning against a railing that shivered under his touch. He remembered the girl who collected echoes, the letter he had never delivered, the lanterns in the mist. They were small threads connecting the past to what might come next, and though the bridge beneath him might collapse, these threads remained steady. A gust of wind carried a whisper of scent, rain, faint smoke, and something floral he couldn't name. Morty closed his eyes and let it fill him, letting the past fold gently into the present. In that quiet breath he realized that he didn't need to know what awaited him beyond the bridge. What mattered was the act of crossing, the slow acknowledgement that life continues even after everything has shifted. He imagined each step as a small act of courage, not heroic, not loud, but meaningful in its quiet insistence. Each plank beneath his feet sang of resilience. Each gust of wind whispered hope. By the time he reached the other side, Morty wasn't the same as he had been when he began. The past still lingered, of course, in echoes and shadows, in fire and in lantern light, but the bridge had carried him forward, connecting what was lost to what might still be found. And as he looked back once at the Citadel, softened by distance and mist, he felt a gentle certainty. Some journeys are not about escaping what has happened, but learning to move through it with care, curiosity, and a quiet heart. Morty drifted through space, though not in a ship that roared or shook. This was a quiet drift, the kind that felt like floating in a dream. Stars stretched in every direction, not as points of light, but as soft threads weaving through the darkness. He didn't know exactly how he got here. Some part of him thought he might have fallen asleep on the bridge, and this was what dreams looked like stretched across infinity. Or perhaps it was real. It didn't matter. The stars felt safe, steady, and patient. A voice echoed somewhere behind him. Not Rick's, not the girl's, but something older, gentler. He turned, and for a moment he imagined all the Mortys he had been, the ones he might have been, and even the ones he would never know. They were scattered among the stars, small points of light themselves, each carrying fragments of memory, courage, and quiet wonder. He reached out a hand, and the space seemed to respond, folding softly around his fingers. Colours shimmered where they touched, delicate and unhurried. He thought of the lanterns in the Citadel, the whispers between walls, the echoes that had been recorded and preserved. Each memory, each small act of noticing, seemed to ripple here in the vastness, gentle but persistent. Somewhere far off he sensed the girl collecting more echoes. Somewhere, survivors carried on in soft routines. Somewhere, the Citadel existed in fragments, as it always would, and Morty, small, quiet, watchful, floated among all of it, a single observer, a keeper of delicate truths. He let himself lean into the stillness, letting the hum of the universe cradle him. There was no rush, no urgent demand, just the patient unfolding of space, time, and memory. And in that space, Morty realized that even the smallest presence, a flicker of thought, a whisper, a hand extended, could be infinite. For a long while, he stayed there, a Morty among stars, breathing softly, holding on to the quiet wonder of everything he had seen, everything he had felt, everything he had yet to understand. Morty sat on the edge of a floating platform, the remnants of a Citadel outpost drifting silently beneath him. Space stretched on in all directions, vast and patient. It was quiet here, except for the faint hum of distant engines and the occasional whisper of starlight brushing against metal. He thought about the choices he had made. Not the big, explosive ones. Those were easy to remember. It was the small ones. Whether to step forward or pause, whether to speak or remain silent, whether to pick up a scrap of light or leave it behind. Each one felt heavier here, in this stillness, where there was nothing to distract him from their meaning. Rick's lessons, though often tangled in chaos and sarcasm, had been there. The girl who collected echoes had reminded him that some things are worth preserving simply for their presence, and the survivors, moving softly among ruins, had shown him that caring for even the smallest fragments can matter more than any grand gesture. Morty closed his eyes and pictured the paths he hadn't taken, corridors unwalked, lanterns never lit, letters never sent, and yet, even in imagining these, he didn't feel regret, only understanding. Every quiet choice, every unnoticed act had shaped him, had brought him here, floating in the calm after the fire, holding fragments of life and memory. A faint pulse of light passed across the platform, reflecting off the edges of his coat and catching in the folds of his hair. It reminded him of the Citadel's lanterns, of the girl's echoes, of the way rain had once smelled warm and sweet in another world. And in that pulse, he felt the weight of choice ease just slightly, not gone, but held gently, like a flame sheltered from wind. He opened his eyes. The universe stretched endlessly, patient and unmoving, and Morty, small and quiet, understood that his choices, no matter how silent, how small, were enough. They were never wasted. They were not forgotten. They existed softly, like whispers between stars, and they would continue to echo long after he had moved on. Morty wandered through the quiet corridors of the Citadel, though quiet no longer meant empty. The spaces around him shimmered with memory, bending and twisting like light through a prism. He could see fragments of the past in gentle flashes, a hand brushing dust from a rail, a child's laugh echoing across a broken plaza, the girl who collected echoes kneeling on the floor, capturing moments he could almost hear. Time felt soft here, not linear, not demanding. Memories overlapped, folded into one another, creating patterns he could watch without needing to understand. One moment, he saw himself stepping onto the long bridge, the morning mist curling around him. The next, he was watching fires fold into smoke, towers crumbling in slow, patient motion. Then a flicker, a quiet memory of Rick sitting across from him, sipping from a chipped mug, speaking softly, even when words didn't matter. He paused in a doorway, letting the scenes wash over him. Each memory held warmth, even when it was tinged with loss. He realized that the Citadel, in all its brokenness, was not just ruins and fire. It was a vessel for the lives it had contained, the small gestures that mattered, the quiet insistence of existence. Morty reached out and touched the wall. Light bent under his fingers, folding in on itself. He could feel the echoes of everyone who had walked these halls, each footprint, each whisper, each choice, bending like light in response. He pressed his palm against the surface and let himself breathe with them, letting the memories fold around him, softening the edges of reality. By the time he stepped back, the corridors were still, the memories settling like dust. And Morty understood softly that nothing truly disappears. Even when moments fade from sight, they bend, they fold, they persist. They linger in the spaces between stars, between breaths, between the quiet and the next day. He smiled gently, a small, quiet acknowledgement of all he had seen, all he had held, and all that would continue. And somewhere softly the echoes of the Citadel whispered in gratitude, bending like light around him. Morty stood on the edge of what remained of a high tower, looking outward across the softened horizon. The Citadel below was a quiet mosaic of broken towers, lingering fires and drifting mist. Above, the sky was pale with early light, stretching endlessly, as if it wanted him to breathe slowly and remember that time had not stopped. The girl who collected echoes walked beside him, but Morty didn't feel the need to speak. Sometimes the quiet between two people is heavier than words, and heavier still when the world around them is fragile and reborn. She pointed to a cluster of lanterns, still flickering in the ruins, and Morty nodded, feeling the gentle reminder that even small lights matter when the darkness lingers. He thought of all he had witnessed, the fires, the shadows, the whispers, the weight of choices, the bending of memories, and he realized the horizon itself seemed different now. Not a line to cross, but a soft boundary where endings meet beginnings. He didn't need to reach it. He only needed to observe, to hold space for what had been, and to breathe in the quiet possibility of what might come. The wind carried faint scents from worlds beyond. Rain, smoke, a hint of flowers he had never named. Morty closed his eyes for a moment, letting it fold around him. In that pause, he understood something profound in its simplicity. The horizon isn't a goal. It is a reminder, a gentle invitation to move, to notice, to care, and to keep listening. He opened his eyes and watched as a small bird landed near a lantern, wings brushing softly against the metal. The tiniest act, unremarkable in scale, yet perfectly enough to make the world feel alive, and Morty, quietly, held that feeling close. Step by step, breath by breath, light by light, he understood the rhythm of survival, the cadence of quiet hope, and the gentle strength that persists even after everything changes. The horizon, soft and patient, waited, as it always had, for him to notice. Morty wandered through the quiet remnants of the Citadel, though the streets felt less empty now. Light lingered in corners where it had no reason to, and echoes of footsteps and laughter drifted like gentle reminders of lives that had once moved here. Some were his own memories, others belonged to people he had never met, yet they all felt intimately familiar. The girl who collected echoes moved silently beside him, device in hand, recording the soft resonance of the city. She didn't speak, and Morty didn't feel the need to. The rhythm of their steps, the hum of the ruined walls, the distant flicker of lanterns, these were their conversation. He paused by a collapsed archway. Through the gap, he could see the faint glow of a distant city, fragments of light drifting across the horizon. And in that glow, Morty imagined echoes travelling, slipping through space and time, finding their way home. Perhaps to Rick's, perhaps to Mortis, perhaps to places he could not yet understand. He reached down and brushed dust from a small piece of broken glass. The reflection caught the sunlight and scattered tiny prisms across the cracked stone. In that moment, he felt the subtle truth of everything he had seen. Even fragments, even remnants, even whispers can return, can linger, can carry meaning back to those who need them most. Morty moved on, each step deliberate, letting the echoes drift behind him, allowing them to fold into the soft spaces of memory. Somewhere, far away, they might be received. Somewhere, someone might feel their warmth. And that was enough. He thought of all the small gestures that mattered. A letter never delivered, a lantern lit in the mist, a hand resting lightly on a wall, the quiet recording of echoes. Each one travelled in its own way, drifting home in time, and Morty, gentle and observant, walked among them, a quiet keeper of their soft passage. By the time he rested atop a low tower, the sun was higher, casting warmth across the broken streets. The Citadel was still scarred, still fragile, but alive in ways invisible, persistent in ways undeniable. And Morty quietly breathed with it, letting every echo fold into him, every memory stretch into the sky. Evening settled over the Citadel with a weightless kind of quiet, not heavy like grief, nor restless like fear, but soft, like a blanket drawn over the shoulders of a world in need of rest. The streets, fractured and winding, carried a faint amber glow as the last lanterns flickered to life. Morty walked alone this time. The girl who collected echoes had gone farther west, chasing a sound she said might disappear if left unheard. Her absence was gentle, not sharp. He could still feel the echo of her presence in the steady rhythm of his own steps. Lanterns hung at uneven heights along a broken causeway. Some swayed slightly in the breeze, their light trembling but not faltering. Morty paused at each one as though greeting them individually. Each seemed to hold a small memory, a laugh, a promise, a quiet farewell. He imagined them as guardians of these fragments, patient keepers of what should not be lost. The sky deepened to a shade between blue and violet. A single star appeared, hesitant but clear. Morty tilted his head, thinking of all the worlds where night had a different name, where lanterns floated on rivers instead of hanging from ropes, where stories were told not in words but in the patterns of shadow and light. At the end of the causeway, one lantern flickered more faintly than the rest. Its glass was cracked, its metal frame warped from heat. Morty reached out, steadying it with both hands. The flame inside was weak, but still there, still trying. Without thinking, he cupped his hands around it, shielding it from the wind until it steadied. When he stepped back, the light glowed warmer, casting a soft halo on the nearby wall. It wasn't much, but in the quiet of the Citadel, it felt like enough. By the time Morty turned toward the central plaza, the stars had multiplied. The lanterns behind him flickered like a slow heartbeat, guiding the way through shadow. Night was coming, but not with fear, only with the hush of a world ready to close its eyes for a while. And Morty, walking in that light, understood that sometimes the last lanterns are not just for seeing, they are for remembering. Morty climbed the final stretch of a crumbled staircase, each step careful, measured. At the top, the Citadel stretched below him in muted colours, the last lanterns swaying softly, their light pooling in the cracks of stone and metal. Above, the sky waited. It was vast and patient, not demanding attention, not rushing him forward, simply there, stretching in quiet invitation. He sat at the edge, legs dangling over empty space, hands resting lightly on the rough stone. Somewhere far away, the girl collecting echoes paused, sensing the quiet settling into the world. Morty let himself breathe slowly, feeling the rhythm of the Citadel beneath him, the lingering warmth of sun and lanterns alike. The horizon blurred in soft hues, folding night into day, stars into clouds, memory into presence. Morty thought about everything that had led him here. The fires, the shadows, the letters never delivered, the tiny acts of care that had made survival meaningful. They all came together in the way a melody might unfold slowly, softly without needing applause. He reached out a hand, imagining he could touch the edges of the horizon itself. Light seemed to bend toward him, gentle and yielding. In that moment, he realized the sky wasn't just above. It was alongside, holding him, holding the Citadel, holding every fragment that mattered. Morty leaned back, letting the vast openness cradle him. Somewhere, the lanterns continued to glow. Somewhere, echoes drifted home. Somewhere, life, fragile and persistent, moved forward, softly without fanfare. And he understood, quietly and fully, that even when the world changes beyond recognition, there is always a place where the sky waits, for listening, for breathing, for being. Morty sat atop a smooth, broken wall, watching the last traces of sunlight melt into the Citadel's ruins. The city had been fractured, scarred, and yet, in its quiet moments, it felt alive. Lanterns flickered here and there, whispers of light in the soft folds of shadow, reminding him that even endings have their own kind of persistence. He inhaled slowly, letting the air carry the faint scent of rain and stone, of fire long cooled, of memories that lingered in corners no one remembered to visit. Each breath felt like a small rhythm, a pulse of calm that mirrored the quiet hum of the world around him. Morty thought about all the choices that had led him here, the small, almost invisible acts that had quietly shaped life in the Citadel. He understood now that heroism did not always roar. Sometimes it was the patience to notice, the courage to linger, the gentleness to protect something fragile, even when no one else was watching. He closed his eyes for a long moment, listening to the hum of echoes, the soft sway of lanterns, the distant whispers of stars, and in that stillness he felt a release, a gentle exhale of everything that had been heavy. He let the weight of memory and experience settle softly, like dust drifting down onto stone floors. When he opened his eyes, night had begun to fold into the horizon. The Citadel's glow was softer, gentler, more forgiving, and Morty smiled, a quiet, contented smile, knowing that even in ruins there was a rhythm to follow, a melody in the quiet, a space where light could linger. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his coat, taking one last look at the streets below. Somewhere echoes drifted, memories found their place, and life, persistent and patient, continued. Morty lay on the highest ledge he could find, gazing at the stars as they shimmered like distant lanterns suspended in space. The Citadel below was calm now, its ruins softened by time and mist, as though the city itself had finally exhaled. The fires had long since died, but their warmth lingered faintly in the air, a memory pressed into stone. He felt the weight of everything he had carried, the letters, the echoes, the quiet acts of care, the moments when he chose to pause and notice. They weren't burdens, they were gentle anchors, holding him steady in a universe that often seemed endless and vast. Each one whispered that life mattered, that small choices mattered, that soft persistence mattered. Somewhere nearby, the girl who collected echoes hummed softly, capturing the subtle vibration of the world. Morty smiled in the darkness, imagining the sound travelling, folding into the quiet folds of space, mingling with the soft light of the stars above. He thought about every Morty he had met, every Rick who had left marks too subtle for words, and every small fragment of kindness that had stitched together a sense of home in the midst of ruin. He stretched his arms wide, feeling the vastness of the universe settle around him, patient and accepting, as though even the stars themselves were breathing alongside him. And in that gentle stretch he understood that endings were not final. They were soft spaces to fold memory, reflection and hope together. Spaces where light continues, where echoes drift home, where the quiet becomes enough. Somewhere the Citadel dreamed. Somewhere echoes shimmered. Somewhere life quietly persisted, and Morty softly folded into it all, letting the calm of stars and memory carry him.